If you lived in America in the 1860s, you'd likely never see a woman's armpit. Not in polite company, not in public, not even at the beach. Modesty was stitched into every layer of clothing, from the bone-tight corsets to the high lace collars that brushed the chin. Sleeves came long, gloves longer, and exposure, especially the underarm, was not just frowned upon. It was unheard of. And yet, tucked behind dressing screens, deep in the folds of household routines, and whispered among the most fashionable girls of the day, there was a quiet obsession growing, one that required a pair of steady hands, a set of tweezers, and nerves of steel. This is the forgotten profession of the armpit plucker. To understand how this strange role came about, we have to step into the parlor of beauty in the 19th century, a world of peculiar rituals, harsh powders, and fleeting standards. It was a time before deodorant, before razors were marketed to women, before cleanliness and fragrance were sold together in little plastic bottles. In 1860, the idea of feminine hygiene was still tangled in mystery, folklore, and social expectation. To be beautiful wasn't just to be seen, it was to be prepared. And sometimes, that preparation hurt. Most girls did not pluck their own underarms. It wasn't considered proper. It wasn't even considered ladylike to talk about such things, let alone to grip a coarse hair with a silver tweezer and yank it out by the root. That sort of business was better left to someone else. Someone discreet. Someone who could enter and exit a room without leaving a trace. This is where the armpit plucker came in. Often, they were older girls, sisters, cousins, or hired help. Sometimes, they were visiting beauticians, midwives who doubled as hair removers, or washerwomen who'd learned the technique from somewhere else. There was no school, no certificate. It was all word of mouth, passed from girl to girl like a recipe or a warning. And the tool of choice wasn't a razor, but a fine-tipped tweezer, usually made of brass or bone, kept wrapped in a velvet pouch and warmed before use. Sessions were quiet, intimate. A girl would lift her arm, carefully, delicately, as if revealing a sin. She would bite down on a handkerchief or a soft piece of wood to keep from crying out. The pain wasn't unbearable, but it was steady, rhythmic, and oddly ceremonial. Each hair plucked was a step closer to something. Something cleaner, something smoother, something worth enduring. You might wonder, why bother at all? If no one could see it, what difference did it make? But you see, that was the point. In 1860, beauty was not for the street. It was for the parlor, for the bedroom, for the dance card handed to a gentleman with shaking fingers. The more hidden something was, the more important it became. A well-plucked armpit wasn't for public display. It was for the private satisfaction of knowing it was done, knowing that beneath the lace and linen, the body was curated, managed, tamed. It was about control. And in a world where most young women had no say over their marriages, inheritances, or even their corset strings, this kind of control, however painful, was intoxicating. There were even fashionable circles where the underarm became a topic of coded conversation. In Boston, for example, a women's magazine ran a short story in 1861 in which the heroine prepares for a visit from a suitor by spending 2 quiet hours in personal refinement, including the plucking of those most shameful strands. The implication was understood. Good girls didn't talk about hair, but great girls made sure it was gone. By the end of the decade, plucking had become so common among certain classes that beauty manuals, printed in small batches for private circulation, began to mention it by code. One 1868 booklet titled On Womanly Cleanliness recommended the silent discipline of the underarms as a mark of true refinement. But public awareness, that would come much later. For now, in 1860, it was still a secret ritual, one done behind lace curtains, beside oil lamps, with nothing but steam and soft breathing to bear witness. And the woman holding the tweezers, she was more than a servant. She was a gatekeeper to an invisible standard, one that hurt and hummed and hid beneath the sleeves of history. It's easy to forget, now, just how much of a woman's body in 1860 was considered taboo. The word armpit didn't appear in public newspapers. The word underarm was whispered, if said at all. and to discuss body hair, especially the idea of removing it, was considered almost obscene. But behind all this silence was a set of expectations so strict, they dictated the shape of a girl's life before she ever put on a corset. From the moment a girl hit puberty, she was expected to begin a long, quiet apprenticeship in personal upkeep. Her mother, or her aunt, or the housemaid, depending on wealth and circumstance, might begin introducing her to the unspoken rituals: how to pad the underarms of a dress to absorb sweat, how to dust her skin with starch or rice powder, how to discreetly cleanse herself without drawing attention to what she was doing. But nowhere in these lessons was there any talk of actual hygiene, not in the modern sense. Water was scarce, baths were rare, soap was harsh, and deodorant, as we know it, simply didn't exist. So the body became a battlefield of improvisation, superstition, and suffering. And in that battlefield, hair removal took on strange and secret significance. For upper-class girls, smoothness meant effort. Effort meant refinement. And refinement meant social capital. The fewer blemishes or disruptions on your skin, the more desirable you were, whether or not anyone ever saw that skin at all. Because desire wasn't about reality. It was about what people imagined. And in the imagination, a perfect lady had perfect skin, even under her arms. Enter the rise of homemade remedies, some of them ingenious, many of them painful. One recipe, copied into dozens of personal beauty journals from the 1850s, recommended a mixture of egg white, quicklime, and arsenic powder. Yes, arsenic. The concoction was painted onto the underarm with a tiny brush and allowed to dry. Then, after a half hour of tingling, or burning, it was scraped off with the edge of a shell or a sliver of ivory. The hair, it was claimed, would slide off like silk threads. What actually slid off, more often than not, was a layer of skin. Other remedies were less poisonous but no less punishing. Pumice stones, vinegar scrubs, and tightly wound twine for hair popping, an early form of threading, all made their rounds in certain circles. But the safest method, and the most sought after, remained simple plucking. Painful, yes, but precise, predictable, and, when done by someone else, oddly soothing. By mid-century, discreet ads began to appear in the backs of women's gazettes and etiquette handbooks. They rarely said what they were actually offering. Instead, they used euphemisms like private consultation for feminine elegance, all areas, manual depilation with guaranteed discretion, gentlewoman offering assistance in delicate refinements. These services weren't advertised broadly. You had to know where to look. Or more often, someone had to tell you. A cousin who whispered at a wedding, a seamstress who let something slip, a friend of the family who knew someone who assisted the daughters of the poor course. That's how girls found their way to Armpit Pluckers. The Pluckers, in turn, built quiet reputations. Some had small, semi-professional setups in the back room of a millinery shop. Others visited homes under the guise of delivering embroidery. Still others worked exclusively by referral, plucking only the right sort of girls, wealthy, silent, and grateful. It wasn't only about hair. It was about ritual. Many sessions began the same way. The client seated on a wooden chair beside the hearth, the plucker wrapping a warm towel around the shoulder to soften the skin. Then a cup of tea, small talk, then silence, the sound of tweezers tapping against a porcelain dish. One girl, writing in her diary in 1863, described the experience this way. I was afraid at first. I thought it would sting, and it did. But there was something in her manner, so precise, so kind. I felt as though my very soul were being groomed. That was the hidden truth. Girls weren't just paying for hair removal. They were paying for attention, for care, for the feeling of being looked after by someone who understood. Because womanhood in 1860 came with a strange contradiction. You were expected to be clean, polished, desirable, but never to admit that you'd tried. You couldn't talk about your grooming. You couldn't let anyone see you sweat, literally or figuratively. You had to emerge, seemingly effortless, like Venus rising from the foam. And that illusion took work. Hard, hidden work. So girls hired pluckers. And pluckers, in turn, kept their secrets. They became confidants, witnesses, sometimes even protectors. In a world where so much of a young woman's life was controlled by others, this ritual, this painful, private, peculiar act, became a rare space where she could choose. Choose how she appeared. Choose what was smooth, what was left alone. Choose, even in the smallest way, what parts of her were hers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was powerful, in its own strange, hushed way. And it was just the beginning. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't hang signs. But among the ladies of 1860s America, everyone knew someone who knew an assistant. You didn't use their names in polite conversation. Instead, you said things like, "She goes to Mrs. Winslow every fourth Tuesday." And if the listener knew, she knew. If not, she never would. So who were these mysterious pluckers? And how did they come to be experts in such a strange, intimate trade? Most were women, older women, widows, seamstresses, former governesses, women who had slipped through society's cracks but hadn't yet fallen all the way down. They needed money, but more than that, they needed work that didn't threaten their respectability. And in the odd hierarchy of Victorian morality, handling another woman's underarms was somehow less scandalous than being seen serving in a tavern or laundering men's collars. Some had started out as ladies' maids in rich households. These women already knew the delicate business of grooming, how to draw a bath without spilling, how to trim eyebrow hairs with embroidery scissors, how to powder the neck so the skin didn't shine under lamplight. When their employment ended, because the lady married or died, they turned that knowledge into something private, quiet, lucrative. A skilled armpit plucker could earn more than a laundress, sometimes as much as a midwife. They charged by the session, or by the hair if the client was especially superstitious. Payment was always in coin, and always discreet, tucked in a glove, wrapped in ribbon, hidden inside a sachet of lavender. No one kept receipts. No one asked for them. But the plucking itself, that was precise, methodical, almost artistic. A good plucker didn't yank. She coaxed. She worked in rhythm, alternating arms, using fingers as steady as a watchmaker's. Some used iron tweezers passed down from their mothers. Others fashioned their own from wire hairpins, bent just so. A few preferred to work by firelight, believing the warm air relaxed the follicles. They learned, over time, what each girl could handle. Some clients sat stiffly, teeth clenched behind a veil. Others chatted nervously or brought a friend for distraction. Some wept without warning. And some, though they would never admit it, seemed to enjoy the pain, as if it gave them a sense of control over their own flesh. The pluckers never judged. They had seen too much. They had seen arms covered in rash from failed home remedies. They had seen bruises not caused by tweezers. They had seen scars, insect bites, inked initials that were never meant to be found. One plucker in Philadelphia, known only as Miss Agatha, kept a little wooden box on her shelf. Inside were trinkets her clients had left behind. A broken cameo, a dried flower, a tiny envelope marked with a single initial. She said she kept them not out of sentiment, but as proof that we were all real once. Some pluckers offered more than just hair removal. They brewed skin-soothing teas. They gave advice about marriage, about love, about how to fake a cough convincingly enough to get out of a dinner. Some taught their clients how to pluck for themselves, though few girls dared try it. And some, though very rarely, offered blessings, prayers, even charms stitched into sachets. Because in 1860, the line between grooming and magic was thinner than we might imagine. Superstition hung over every part of a woman's body. Hair was considered powerful, capable of attracting love, repelling evil, carrying disease. Some girls insisted that their plucked hairs be burned immediately. Others asked to keep them, pressing them between pages of a Bible. A few worried that leaving their underarm hair unplucked would cause it to grow inside, corrupting the heart. Of course, most of this had no basis in fact. But fact didn't matter. What mattered was belief. And pluckers, in their own quiet way, catered to belief. They were part beautician, part confessor, part folkloric priestess. And they understood something most men didn't. that the body, especially a woman's body, was a political and spiritual battlefield. That grooming wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about being seen in a world that pretended not to look. It was about reclaiming control, even if that control came in the form of a wince, a tug, a moment of practice pain. In an age where women couldn't vote, couldn't own property after marriage, and often couldn't choose their own husbands, hiring someone to pluck their armpits was, strangely, a small act of autonomy. They were choosing how they appeared, choosing who touched them, choosing what pain they accepted and what they refused. And the women who offered this service, these unlicensed, unsung, unthanked pluckers, gave them that choice. For a price, yes, but with gentleness, with ceremony, with the kind of care that couldn't be found in medicine or scripture or even love. They weren't written about. They weren't on it, but they mattered. They made young women feel clean, not just in the body, but in the soul. And they did it one hair at a time. The first pluck always stung the most. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, married or unmarried, 16 or 60. The nerves clustered under the arm didn't discriminate. The moment those iron tweezers pinched and pulled, the truth came out. Some women gasped. Others bit the insides of their cheeks until they tasted blood. And some, holding their breath with Victorian dignity, simply said, "Continue." For many girls in 1860, the experience of being plucked wasn't just about beauty. It was about enduring something, proving something, becoming someone else, or maybe, more fully, the person they already were beneath the petticoats and pettiness of daily life. Pain was part of the ritual, but it wasn't the worst part. That honor went to the shame. Armpits were private, oddly sacred. They were not supposed to be seen, even by other women. They were the softest, warmest, sweatiest parts of a woman's body, and to expose them in the lamplight of a stranger's parlor was no small act. Some girls kept their arms clamped tight for minutes before they could even let the plucker in. Others brought powder and perfume, frantically applying both before stepping into the room, terrified they might smell like themselves. The shame was laid. It wasn't just about odor or hair. It was about being handled, about being made aware that you had a body at all. Because in 1860, the ideal woman was not supposed to have a body, not one with hair and sweat and nerve endings. She was supposed to float gracefully above such things, like a statue with no pause. The plucking shattered that illusion. Each tug was a reminder, you are real. You are flesh. And for some women, that was liberating. There's a strange sort of power in being undone, in choosing, willingly, to be made vulnerable. And in the hush of those appointments, curtains drawn, hands steady, silver tweezers glinting in the lamplight, a quiet revolution was taking place. Women were reclaiming parts of themselves they were told to ignore. The pluckers knew how to make it bearable. Some sang hymns under their breath. Others whispered old folk rhymes. A few told stories, or asked questions to keep the mind busy. One famous plucker in Savannah always served lemon water with mint before beginning. Another in Chicago offered clients a ribbon to bite down on. Not because it was needed, but because it gave them something to hold. And they never rushed. A full underarm might take 30 minutes, sometimes more. If the skin was red or tender, the session paused. Cold cloths were applied. Lavender oil dabbed gently behind the ears. It wasn't just grooming. It was almost medical, almost spiritual. And yet, it wasn't all solemnity. In some parlors, laughter flowed freely. Girls joked about the absurdity of it all. Fancy paying to be tortured, one client exclaimed, to which the plucker replied, "That's womanhood, day." They swapped gossip, whispered secrets, confessed things that hadn't even been shared with mothers or friends. These rooms, for all their strange purpose, became sanctuaries, and the women who visited weren't always the same after. Some described feeling lighter, not just in the body, but in the mind. One diary from 1861 recounted a girl's first plucking. "I felt I had shed something I had carried too long. Not just hair, a sort of silence I did not know was there." Others compared it to confession, or to the sensation of shedding an old skin. There were side effects: redness, itching, occasionally ingrown hairs. A few girls fainted. One became hysterical mid-session, crying out that she was being punished for her sins. The plucker, experienced and calm, simply held a hand until the subs passed, then resumed, saying nothing. The emotional weight of plucking could be intense, especially for women who had never been touched gently before. In a world where husbands were often rough, doctors indifferent, and fathers stern, the touch of a careful stranger, a woman whose only task was to make you feel clean, was oddly profound. It lingered. Some women returned weekly, even when they had little to pluck. They claimed it was for maintenance, but many came for the ritual, for the half-hour of attention, for the simple feeling of being cared for. And while no one spoke of it in public, the knowledge passed quietly from sister to sister, cousin to cousin, friend to friend. It doesn't hurt forever, one girl whispered to another in a boarding school in Maine, only at first. Then it's like flying. No one ever said the word empowerment. It wasn't in fashion yet, but in their own strange way, these women were practicing it. One painful tug at a time. They didn't fight loss. They didn't give speeches, but they claimed their bodies. And in 1860, that alone was a revolution. There was no sign on the door, no bold advertisement, no listing in the city directory. Yet somehow, everyone knew where to go. In cities like Boston, Charleston, and Cincinnati, armpit plucking became a quiet but lucrative side economy. Some practitioners operated out of back rooms in millinery shops or under the guise of dress fittings. Others used parlor rooms in boarding houses or rented single chairs in already crowded apothecaries. It wasn't illegal, but it was delicate. You didn't announce you were going to have your armpits plucked. You asked for an appointment or said you were stopping in for maintenance. Everyone pretended not to know, but everyone knew. The most successful pluckers weren't just good with tweezers. They were brilliant businesswomen. Many of them had once worked as hairdressers, midwives, even fortune tellers. Some were former ladies' maids who had learned, through careful observation, what wealthy women wanted and how to deliver it. They managed appointments with the precision of a military drill. They scheduled return visits, tracked individual preferences, and built entire client rosters out of whispered referrals. One well-known plucker in Philadelphia reportedly serviced over 80 women a month from her attic suite, lit by a single skylight and furnished with velvet cushions and lemon balm tea. They charged by the session, never by the hair. That would have been undignified. Most rates range from 15 cents for a quick tidy-up to a full $1 for the deluxe experience, which included perfume, trimming, and the application of a cooling lotion said to contain rose water, alum, and crushed cucumber. And business was good. Even in lean times, women found a way to afford their plucking. They pawned trinkets, skipped pastries, reused ribbons. Because this wasn't just grooming, it was a service of status, a mark of pride. A woman with bare, sweet-smelling underarms could hold her head a little higher in church pews and sewing circles. The pluckers themselves, though often quiet, wielded surprising influence. They knew secrets. Who was having an affair? Who was pregnant? Who cried when no one was looking? They heard the quiet confessions of girls who didn't trust their mothers, and the complaints of matrons who felt invisible in their own homes. In a world where a woman's value was tied to what she didn't say, the pluckers became keepers of everything left unspoken. Most took that responsibility seriously. They created rules. No gossiping about clients. No sharing of names. A few even kept coded ledgers so that appointments appeared to be innocent. Floral delivery times, hat size fittings, music tutoring. In cities with vice crackdowns or aggressive church elders, this kind of record-keeping could mean the difference between discretion and disgrace. Still, not everyone was supportive. Moral reformers, mostly male, mostly loud, warned that grooming practices like armpit plucking were signs of female vanity overtaking piety. They wrote letters to editors, preached sermons, claimed it was a slippery slope from bare skin to moral ruin. One 1862 pamphlet, The Folly of Fleshly Pride, included an entire chapter on the satanic embrace of depilation. The pluckers ignored them. They had clients lined up from dawn till dusk. And they weren't only serving high society women, either. Factory girls came on their lunch breaks. Teachers stopped by on Saturdays. Even nuns, according to one anonymous diary entry, requested discreet home visits from trusted practitioners. God may judge me, the note read, but I feel cleaner in my prayers. There were also imitators. Some men tried to enter the trade, advertising themselves as French grooming specialists or underarm experts, hoping to profit off the growing trend. But most women refused them. The intimacy of the work required trust, and trust, in this case, was reserved for other women. The female body had already been too public, too observed. It needed hands that understood. Meanwhile, competitors tried to sell alternatives. Chemical depilatories, pastes and powders made with lye or quicklime, were marketed in cheap broadsheets, promising pain-free smoothness. But these often burned the skin, left rashes, or simply didn't work. One woman wrote in her journal, "The potion removed neither hair nor sin, though I fear both are now inflamed." Others invented strange mechanical devices, spring-loaded tweezers, rotating brushes, even wind-up plucking boxes. None lasted. The human touch was irreplaceable. By the end of the 1860s, some pluckers had become minor legends. Clients gifted them brooches. Poets mentioned them in passing. One even had her likeness sketched in the corner of a ladies' magazine, labeled simply, "The Rose of the Room Upstairs." But they rarely grew rich. Most earned just enough to live well, keep teeth stocked, and maybe send a niece to school. What they did collect, quietly, consistently, was something else. A kind of whispered legacy, proof that women, even in a time of corsets and constraint, found ways to care for one another, to preserve their dignity, and to claim, in the most surprising of ways, their own bodies. It often began with a knock, not loud, not urgent, but deliberate, a rhythm that signaled discretion. No names were exchanged. The woman entering might be a wealthy merchant's wife or tired seamstress, a school teacher or a newlywed still adjusting to married life. In this space, those distinctions melted away. Everyone came for the same reason, to feel seen, soothed, and slightly more themselves. The plucking chamber was modest. A clean chair by the window, perhaps cushioned with velvet or linen. A small tray with lemon water and tiny tools, tweezers, scissors, perfumed cloths. There might be a mirror, but often it was turned around. The point wasn't vanity. It was care. Most sessions began with conversation. Not small talk, exactly, but soft, rhythmic dialogue that helped the woman settle. The plucker would ask if the skin was sore, if they had been itching, if the client had tried one of those new powders she'd read about in Harper's Weekly. Sometimes the client would laugh. Sometimes she'd wince. But always, there was trust. It often began with a knock. Not loud, not urgent, but deliberate. A rhythm that signaled discretion. No names were exchanged. The woman entering might be a wealthy merchant's wife or tired seamstress, a school teacher or a newlywed still adjusting to married life. In this space, those distinctions melted away. Everyone came for the same reason, to feel seen, soothed, and slightly more themselves. The plucking chamber was modest. A clean chair by the window, perhaps cushioned with velvet or linen. A small tray with lemon water and tiny tools, tweezers, scissors, perfumed cloths. There might be a mirror, but often it was turned around. The point wasn't vanity. It was care. Most sessions began with conversation. Not small talk, exactly, but soft, rhythmic dialogue that helped the woman settle. The plucker would ask if the skin was sore, if they had been itching, if the client had tried one of those new powders she'd read about in Harper's Weekly. Sometimes the client would laugh. Sometimes she'd wince. But always, there was trust. The plucker would begin by brushing the underarm area lightly with a warm cloth, sometimes infused with rose water or chamomile tea. This helped to soften the skin, to raise the fine hairs, and, though no one said it out loud, to break the ice. There's something humbling about letting another person touch a part of your body the world insists you hide. But in this room, that shame was suspended. She would then begin the plucking, slowly, deliberately, hair by hair. The sensation was strange, not quite painful, but not painless either. Some women squeezed their eyes shut and imagined hymns. Others chatted the entire time, talking about their children, their husbands, the dress they wanted to wear on Easter Sunday. One woman recited Shakespeare's sonnets as a form of distraction. Another quietly hummed lullabies. There was a kind of rhythm to it. Pluck, pause, pluck, press. A syncopation that lulled many women into a state somewhere between discomfort and dream. The act, though clinical in nature, became strangely tender. It was one woman caring for another in a way the outside world never acknowledged. Privacy was essential. Most pluckers never allowed more than one client at a time. Curtains were drawn, doors locked. In some places, especially in more conservative towns, clients arrived with shawls pulled over their heads, avoiding neighbors' eyes. A few even wore gloves to hide their identities, as though the hands themselves might betray them. There were rituals, too, unwritten but deeply followed. No mirrors during the process. No commenting on body shape. No unsolicited advice. The plucker's role was not to judge or instruct. She was there to serve, to support, to keep secrets. After the plucking, a cooling lotion was applied, sometimes made from cucumber, lavender, or vinegar and baking soda. This part was almost universally loved. The relief, the scent, the way it felt to have that last gesture of care. It mattered. Some women stayed after, just for a few minutes, to sip tea, to breathe, to sit in a place where the world didn't expect anything of them. One diary entry from 1861 described it as an island in the week, where no one asked me what I've made for supper or why I'm not smiling. And then, as quietly as they had arrived, they left. Most didn't talk about it, even with close friends. It wasn't scandalous, not exactly, but it wasn't entirely respectable either. It lived in that strange space between grooming and intimacy, health and indulgence. And for many, that made it all the more precious. The emotional aftermath of an armpit plucking appointment was surprisingly profound. Clients reported feeling lighter, calmer, more in control. It wasn't just about hygiene. It was about reclaiming something, a small square of skin, a half acre of peace, a sense of quiet agency. For some, it became a lifeline. Widows, especially, sought out the service. In a world that had shifted beneath their feet, where men had died, money had disappeared, and futures looked uncertain, this tiny act of self-maintenance became an anchor. It reminds me I'm still here. One woman wrote in a letter never sent. And then there were the young girls. Teenagers, uncertain and watchful, often came in pairs. One would go first while the other waited nervously in the next room. They laughed too loudly, asked too many questions, and tried to pretend it didn't hurt. But once the first hair was gone, and the reality of it settled in, they quieted, and the transformation began, not just of the body, but of the self. By the late 1860s, armpit plucking was no longer a novelty. It was a ritual, a quiet, hidden rite passed from woman to woman, behind closed doors and drawn curtains. It left no permanent mark, no record in the newspapers. And yet, for those who participated, it lingered on the skin, in the senses, and in the heart. It was not about beauty, not really. It was about care. And in a century where so much of a woman's body was legislated, dismissed, or denied, the act of choosing how it should feel, how it should smell, how it should be treated, became something quietly radical. Even now, if you close your eyes and breathe in deep, you can almost smell the rose water. The women who performed these quiet acts of grooming, these pluckers, were not written into the official story of the 19th century. You won't find their names in census records under any respectable occupation, nor will you find their testimonials in beauty manuals. But they existed, quietly, carefully, with tweezers in hand and rosewater on the stove. Most were not trained in medicine, though some had experience as midwives or herbalists. A few came from backgrounds in hairdressing or millinery, professions that also required close handling of clients and social discretion. Others simply had steady hands, patience, and a reputation for gentleness. In a time when nearly every form of bodily care was restricted by gender, class, and propriety. These women filled a unique niche. They were part beautician, part confidant, part healer. Some pluckers ran their own private parlors, modest, one-room setups outfitted with lace curtains, wooden chairs, and a small collection of lotions and tools. Others worked out of their homes, transforming kitchens or sewing rooms into temporary sanctuaries. A few traveled, especially in rural areas, visiting clients by appointment, carrying their tools in small velvet pouches tucked into reticules or baskets. The pay was modest, but reliable. In cities like Philadelphia or Boston, a well-regarded plucker could earn more than a seamstress and nearly as much as a governess. Clients tipped generously, especially if the service included conversation, tea, or light herbal treatments. And because discretion was the rule, there were no printed advertisements, only whispered recommendations, subtle gestures, coded invitations written between lines of a letter. Many pluckers were unmarried or widowed. Some had once been housemaids or laundrywomen. A few were educated but shut out of more formal professions due to gender or circumstance. They were, in many ways, women in transition, living between the lines of society's rules. One account describes a plucker named Liddy, a widow with 5 daughters who converted the front room of a Baltimore row house into a makeshift beauty parlor. She kept a kettle on at all times, played quiet violin music from a phonograph, and welcomed women of all classes, as long as they came alone and left their names at the door. She was known for her feather-light touch and her uncanny ability to remember every client's birthday and favorite scent. Another was a young Irish immigrant named Bridget, barely 20, who began plucking underarms and eyebrows in New York tenements for extra income. She charged 5 cents per session and always finished with a dab of lavender oil. By the time she was 26, she was supporting her entire family with what her brother jokingly called ladies' underarm therapy. But not all pluckers were warmly received. In stricter towns and villages, women accused of offering unseemly services were fined or warned by the local constable. Some clergy denounced the practice outright, claiming it encouraged vanity, temptation, or worse. Rumors swirled, often unfairly, conflating the intimacy of the procedure with something scandalous. In reality, most pluckers maintained strict boundaries. Clients were protected, names were never repeated, and the tone was always professional, if occasionally maternal. It was not a brothel. It was not a gossip parlor. It was a place where a woman could attend to her own body without shame, where the act of grooming became an act of autonomy. Still, the very existence of such a profession revealed deeper truths. It showed that even in the most repressive social climates, women found ways to care for each other, quietly, skillfully, and with deep mutual respect. It showed that beneath the starched collars and high necklines of 1860, a network of informal labor and intimacy was thriving. Invisible to men, invaluable to women. It also showed how beauty and cleanliness were more than skin deep. They were emotional, political, spiritual. Pluckers knew that their work mattered, even if society refused to acknowledge it. They listened to secrets, mended moods, provided moments of stillness in chaotic lives. One plucker kept a small book of pressed flowers, giving each client a petal after the session to carry softness with them into the world. They were not just removing hair. They were restoring something, a sense of control, of identity, of being seen. And yet, they left almost no trace. No photographs, no public memoirs, just rumors, snippets, and the occasional mention in private letters or diary pages. I went to Mrs. T today. The usual treatment. Left lighter, thank God. Spent the morning with the plucker. She tells such good stories. Felt nearly human again afterward. These women became ghosts of the trade, not because they were forgotten, but because they were never officially allowed to exist. They were too intimate to be acknowledged and too useful to be banned. And so, like many women's histories, they lived in the gaps, between the lines of respectable memory. But if you listen carefully, you can still hear them. The quiet scrape of a chair leg, the rustle of a cotton sleeve, the soft click of silver tweezers on a porcelain dish. They were there, and they mattered. By the dawn of the 20th century, The armpit pluckers had already begun to fade. Slowly, quietly, the way many women's professions vanish, not with a scandal or headline, but with a shrug of progress and a change in fashion. Part of the reason was simple: razors. As safety razors became more accessible and widely advertised, especially after the introduction of the Gillette razor in 1901, the need for someone else to remove body hair began to disappear. What had once been a specialized act requiring another person's help could now be done alone, in the privacy of one's own washroom. It was sold as independence, modernity, cleanliness you could buy and perform yourself. At the same time, new beauty standards were being aggressively marketed by magazines and corporations. Underarm hair wasn't just a personal preference anymore. It became a sign of modern womanhood, a detail now policed by full-page ads, dress patterns, and etiquette manuals. And with that came new tools, new rituals, and a new industry: commercial beauty. In this modern, industrialized age of creams, powders, depilatories, and salon chains, there was no room for the plucker with her rosewater and silver tweezers. Her touch was too gentle, too personal, too tied to an older kind of intimacy. She didn't scale. She didn't advertise. She didn't fit into the tidy categories of the beauty aisle. And so, she disappeared. Not because she failed, but because the world around her changed. Many former pluckers quietly transitioned into other roles. Some became salon attendants or nurses. Others returned to domestic work. A few were absorbed into the newly forming esthetician trade, though without official recognition or titles. Their work became background noise, absorbed into broader histories of beauty without ever being named. The women they once served, they, too, moved on. Some took to shaving. Others, influenced by European trends, experimented with waxing or creams. But they remembered, even if they never spoke of it, they remembered the feeling of sitting in a quiet room while another woman tended to them with gentle hands. They remembered the stillness, the comfort, the unspoken understanding that passed between them, a rare space in which being a woman was not a performance, but a quiet collaboration. And occasionally, you catch a glimmer of those memories, in an old letter tucked into a family Bible, in the margins of a domestic journal. So am again today, left with less weight, inside and out. Or in the whispered recollection of a great-grandmother who once said, "There used to be a woman on 2nd Street. No sign. Just a curtain in the window. You'd leave feeling new." These were the echoes. But beyond the personal, the story of the armpit pluckers tells us something larger about how history chooses what to remember. Professions tied to women's bodies, especially those involving touch, care, or intimacy, are often the first to vanish. They are deemed too minor, too soft, too embarrassing to preserve. And yet, they shaped lives. Quietly, persistently, they filled the gaps between major events and public revolutions. They kept dignity alive in tenement rooms, offered ritual in the absence of luxury, and created a space where being seen wasn't dangerous, but healing. The pluckers may not have marched or published or preached, but they mattered. They showed up, with steady hands and soft towels. They remembered names. They listened. They stayed late. They noticed. And perhaps that is why their legacy lingers, not in textbooks, but in gestures, in the way a friend reaches out to brush hair from your shoulder, in the comfort of a trusted salon chair, in the hush of a room where no one expects you to perform, only to be. That legacy is not loud, but it is strong, because beneath the noise of history, beneath the headlines and wars and political movements, there's another kind of story, one made of hands and hearts and hush. A story where care is not a transaction, but a practice. Where being human is not a flaw to hide, but a truth to tend to. And in that story, the armpit plucker stands, not as an oddity, but as a symbol of what we lose when we forget the small things, and what we gain when we remember them. Even now, her presence flickers, just at the edge of the story, in the soft scent of lavender water, in the rustle of skirts and the quiet click of tweezers in a dish. A reminder that the history of care, though invisible, is never gone. It waits. In the silence, in the touch, in the knowing smile passed from one woman to another, across generations.